March 10, 1944. The wind cut sharp across the Ural forest, carrying snow that clung to rusted barbed wire and sagging watchtowers. Inside the perimeter of a Soviet prisoner of war camp, the morning roll call dragged on. Guards in heavy coats barked orders in Russian, their boots crunching across ice. In front of them, rows of German women, nurses who had once dressed battlefield wounds, auxiliaries who had operated searchlights and radios, factory workers conscripted to serve the Reich, stood shivering in thin, worn coats. Frostbitten fingers clutched at scarves, and every breath lingered in the frozen air. In the middle of this bleakness, a small discovery shifted the weight of despair. One prisoner, a nurse from Hamburg, reached into her pocket and revealed a shard of soap. It was cracked gray and barely larger than a coin, smuggled into the camp's underground barter system. To most, it would have seemed trivial. But in this world of mud floors, lice infestations, and icy water basins, it was a treasure more valuable than gold. She held it out for the others to see. A murmur rippled through the group. Another woman whispered, "Sife, ex-sife." Real soap. The word itself seemed to carry warmth. In that moment, the smallest gesture, a chance to wash hands, to scrub away dirt, to smell something other than rot, felt like resistance. That evening, the women crowded around a tin basin filled with melted snow. The nurse rubbed the shard between her palms until suds appeared, thin but miraculous. She passed it to the next prisoner, who did the same, each woman dipping her hands into the icy water as if part of a sacred ritual. The guards ignored them, uninterested in what looked like meaningless routine. But for the prisoners, it was an act of defiance. To be clean, even for a moment, was to assert that they were still human beings, not merely numbers on a Soviet labor roster. Letters and diaries smuggled out of camps later recorded the weight of that moment. One auxiliary wrote, "We had almost forgotten the smell of clean hands. When I touched my face that night, it was as though a veil had lifted. For one night, I was not a prisoner. I was myself again." Soap became more than hygiene. It became memory. The feel of lather reminded them of kitchens back home, of mothers scrubbing laundry on wooden boards, of Saturday evenings when families prepared for church. Each sliver was a connection to a life that felt impossibly distant yet painfully near. In the barracks, women spoke quietly about their children, husbands, or brothers still fighting at the front. They spoke of cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin, which even then trembled under Allied bombs. Every word carried fear, but also determination. Amid hunger, frostbite, and despair, the soap was a paradox, a fragment of civilization in a place designed to erase it. It gave them dignity when everything else had been stripped away. Their uniforms replaced with rags, their names replaced with prisoner numbers, their freedom replaced with the endless monotony of camp labor. One young secretary, barely 20, summed up the feeling when she whispered to a friend, "If we can stay clean, we can stay alive." It was not a statement of vanity, but of survival. In a world where typhus and dysentery spread like wildfire, cleanliness meant life. But it also meant something deeper. Clean skin reminded them that they were not defeated spirits, even if they were prisoners. The guards may have held the rifles, but the women clung to rituals that kept their humanity intact. Soaked water, whispered songs at night, these became tools of quiet rebellion. In every lathered hand, in every scrubbed face, dignity was restored, however fleeting. This opening moment sets the haunting paradox that will run throughout their story. These women, captured, displaced, and surrounded by barbed wire, found fragments of life worth holding on to. And as a shard of soap dissolved into their hands, a question emerged that history has never fully answered. How could dignity survive in a place designed for despair? The story now steps back, asking how these women came to stand behind the wire at all, how nurses, clerks, and factory workers found themselves prisoners in the vast machinery of World War II. Before barbed wire and frozen basins, there were factories, hospitals, and command posts. To understand why German women ended up in Soviet camps, the story must step back into the machinery of the Reich itself. By 1942, as the Wehrmacht extended deep into Eastern Europe, Hitler's regime demanded labor from every corner of German society. Women were pulled into service not only as wives and mothers, but as auxiliaries to the war machine. Some enlisted willingly, seduced by propaganda posters that promised honor, travel, and purpose. Others were pressed into uniforms by labor decrees, ordered to fill shortages as the war devoured men. They appeared in many forms. There were Red Cross nurses tending shattered soldiers on the Eastern Front, their aprons stained with blood. There were Luftwaffe auxiliaries, the Helferinnen, who manned telephones, tracked aircraft, and operated searchlights during night raids. Secretaries clattered at typewriters in command posts, transcribing orders that moved divisions across maps. Factory girls worked in armaments plants or followed supply convoys eastward, tasked with keeping the Reich's war machine alive in hostile territories. One nurse later wrote in her diary, "We thought we would heal, that our mission was mercy, but the front devoured even mercy." The front did not distinguish between roles. When the Red Army began its massive counteroffensives in 1943 and 1944, at Kursk, across the Dnieper, through the ruins of Kharkov, civilian and auxiliary alike were caught in its sweep. Nurses in makeshift hospitals suddenly found themselves surrounded by Soviet troops. Women clerks who had typed orders one morning were marched under guard by evening. Even factory workers who had followed supply trains into Ukraine were branded as enemy assets and treated as prisoners of war. For many, the decision to serve had been shaped by family. Daughters followed brothers, wives followed husbands, fiancés followed lovers. One young secretary, captured near Smolensk, recalled telling her interrogator, "I only came because he asked me. He is dead now, and yet I remain here." In the Soviet system, distinctions blurred quickly. A nurse might plead that she had only changed bandages, not carried a rifle. A telephonist might insist she had never touched a weapon. To the Red Army, they were all part of the same apparatus that had burned villages and occupied cities. Civilians were branded collaborators. Women in uniform were marched alongside soldiers. Even the act of speaking German behind the lines could be enough to earn captivity. The irony was brutal. Women trained to heal, to stitch wounds, or distribute rations were treated as combatants. Their white aprons and clerical armbands offered no protection when the front collapsed. They were gathered in columns, stripped of belongings, and pushed westward or eastward into holding pens, then further into the Soviet interior. Letters that survived reveal a haunting shift in identity. One woman wrote to her parents in Munich, "I left home as a nurse. I arrived here as a prisoner. Somewhere along the road, I stopped being your daughter and became only number 147. By 1944, tens of thousands of German women were held in Soviet custody. Some were moved to temporary enclosures, schoolyards, barns, abandoned factories, before boarding trains that carried them deeper east. Others ended up in Allied hands when the Western Front cracked after Normandy, though their fate differed sharply from those in Soviet camps. But in every case, their paths converged in a single paradox. Women who had once lived in the relative safety of Hamburg or Munich, who had walked streets lined with cafes and cinemas, now clutched at scraps of food, soap, or dignity behind foreign fences. This chapter explains why the shard of soap in Chapter 1 mattered so much. These women were not nameless prisoners plucked from nowhere. They had once been students, nurses, clerks, daughters, and wives. Their journey from factories and hospitals to the frozen compounds of the Ural Forest reveals the crushing sweep of a total war that consumed not only armies, but every civilian it could touch. The trains rattled eastward, their wooden carriages sealed against escape, but not against the bitter cold. Straw scattered on the floor offered little insulation. Women huddled together, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath condensing on the slats of the wagon. Some had been nurses, some clerks, others factory girls, but now all were reclassified by Soviet decree as labor assets. The NKVD bureaucracy was merciless in its precision. Each woman was cataloged by name, date of birth, and occupation. Their identities as healers, mothers, or daughters disappeared into columns of ink. The Soviet state did not see them as prisoners of war covered by the Geneva Convention, nor as civilians entitled to humanitarian aid. They were units of work, destined for factories, timber camps, and collective farms. Unlike German POWs in American hands, no Red Cross parcels arrived. No inspection teams toured the compounds. Parcels of bread, tins of meat, or bars of chocolate that might have been delivered were intercepted, withheld, or never acknowledged. Hunger became the daily rhythm, dictated not by rations but by quotas. Behind the barbed wire, the contradiction sharpened. The official machinery of captivity stripped them of individuality. But in the shadows, the women began to create their own systems of survival. Nurses tore strips from their own clothing to wrap frostbitten hands and feet. A diary entry from one prisoner read, "We had no bandages, so I used my apron. By nightfall, it was stiff with blood and ice, but it was all I could give." Clerks, once trained to type orders for generals, now scratched notes in the margins of Soviet propaganda leaflets. These fragments became secret diaries, a record of names, dates, memories. Tiny rebellions against erasure. Factory workers, who had once stood at assembly lines in Hamburg or Cologne, began to rebuild another kind of economy. A piece of soap could be bartered for a slice of bread, a spare button for a needle, a worn scarf for a handful of firewood. Soap, in particular, became a kind of currency. It kept lice at bay, offered protection against typhus, and preserved a sliver of dignity. A woman might whisper to another at night, "I will mend your gloves if you share a corner of soap." These transactions, invisible to guards, gave structure to lives otherwise dictated by bureaucracy. The camps themselves were landscapes of contradiction. Rows of wooden barracks stretched beneath the watchtowers, their interiors dim, unheated, and crowded. Rations arrived in metal buckets. Thin cabbage soup, coarse bread, sometimes fish bones. Yet in corners of these barracks, voices rose and whispered songs, prayers, or jokes that mocked the propaganda speeches blaring from loudspeakers. For the authorities, paperwork determined who lived and who was broken. Prisoners were sorted into categories. Heavy labor for the strong, menial work for frail, hospital wards for the dying. A nurse remembered the chilling efficiency. It was not the rifle that sentenced you, but the pen. But within that system, the women quietly rebuilt fragments of humanity. They carved combs from scraps of wood, shared stories of home during roll call, and traded lullabies as though they were contraband. Evenings became a fragile theater of memory. One prisoner would recall the smell of fresh bread in Munich, another the sound of church bells in Dresden, another the laughter of a child left behind. Together, they pieced a mosaic of life beyond the wire, a reminder that they were more than labor assets. The bureaucracy intended to erase identity. The women's improvisations preserved it. Every secret diary, every barter, every whispered memory was a statement. Captivity could dictate their bodies, but not wholly their spirit. As the snow deepened around the compounds, a paradox emerged. Official structures sought to grind them into numbers, but their own systems, built on scraps of soap, scraps of memory, reassembled them into human beings once more. From here, the story moves deeper into the heart of their resilience, where soap itself became not just survival, but defiance. In the frozen expanse of the Soviet camp, survival was measured in rations of bread and ladles of soup, but dignity was measured in soap. Bars of soap, small and brittle, were rarer than gold. Prisoners who managed to secure one tucked it into cloth pouches, hidden beneath mattresses, or sewn into hems of dresses. Guards themselves coveted it, sometimes hoarding it for their families. In this strange economy, soap became both commodity and shield, protecting against lice, typhus, and the slow descent into despair. A nurse remembered one transaction with clarity. She mended a guard's torn winter coat, stitching quietly by lamplight. In return, he slid a bar of soap across the table, wordless but deliberate. She later wrote, "It was the first time in months I felt I had earned something of worth, not begged for it." Among the prisoners, soap sparked both conflict and connection. Two women once clashed bitterly over the ownership of a rag used for washing. Their voices rose, drawing the attention of others. But as tempers cooled, laughter broke the tension. They ended up scrubbing their hands side by side in icy water, the rags stretched thin but shared. These small vignettes reveal the paradox. Soap cleansed more than skin. It became a psychological bomb, a way to scrape off the filth imposed by captivity. To be clean was to insist upon humanity in a place designed to strip it away. Evenings became rituals of resistance. Women scavenged twigs to scrub themselves raw, boiled water in rusted tin cans, and passed around combs carved from bone or scraps of wood. These routines, though primitive, created order in a landscape ruled by chaos. They also carried defiance. Lice and filth were weapons of war, spread intentionally in overcrowded barracks to weaken morale. Each act of washing was a refusal to submit. Letters and diaries testify to this fragile dignity. One clerk wrote, "I traded bread for soap. Hunger gnawed at me, but when I washed, I remember my mother's hands, how she insisted I leave for school with clean nails. For a moment, I was her daughter again, not a number in a camp." Soap passed from hand to hand, its meaning shifting with each trade. For some, it was sustenance exchanged for food. For others, it was warmth, traded for a strip of cloth to line a shoe or a button for a coat. And for many, it was memory, a fragment of life before captivity. The guards, too, understood its value. On rare occasions, they used soap as leverage. A sliver offered to a prisoner could buy silence, loyalty, or labor, yet the women reshaped its power. Instead of letting soap remain an instrument of control, they turned it into a shared symbol, an anchor of solidarity. At night, after work assignments and roll calls, women huddled together to wash their hands, faces, or hair. The cold stung their skin, but the act itself revived them. One whispered prayer often followed. Gratitude not for freedom, but for the chance to feel human again. Within the wire, every bar of soap told a story. Stories of barter and betrayal, of laughter after quarrels, of mothers remembered, of wounds tended, of dignity reclaimed. It was a currency not only a trade but a resistance, proof that even in a system bent on dehumanization, they could carve out fragile victories. From the paperwork of bureaucracy to the rituals of cleanliness, captivity was both prison and paradox. And as the months stretched on, whispers began to fill the barracks. Whispers of solidarity, of forbidden jokes, of voices refusing to be silenced. Night in the camp was not silent. Beneath the hum of wind against corrugated roofs and the occasional bark of guards' order, there were whispers, soft, persistent, and defiant. When the day's labor ended and the barracks grew dim, German women gathered close, their voices weaving fragile threads of memory and hope. They spoke of home, of children evacuated to the countryside, of kitchens once filled with the smell of bread, of rivers where they had bathed in summers past. These whispers were not idle nostalgia. They were lifelines. In the dark, laughter flickered when someone dared to tell a coded joke mocking Nazi slogans or the absurdities of camp propaganda. A prayer passed quietly down a row of bunks, one woman murmuring the words and another finishing them, as if faith itself had to be smuggled. Resistance often began in these hushed hours. Some women organized clandestine schools, teaching arithmetic on scraps of paper, or rehearsing Russian phrases to prepare for interrogations and labor commands. Others, with smuggled pencils, copied hymns into the margins of discarded pamphlets. A single verse could be passed from one barack to another, like contraband hope. There were also whispers of paper folded small enough to escape notice. Leaflets from the Red Cross, sometimes smuggled into the camp. They carried news of the outside world, reports of prisoner exchanges, lists of captured soldiers, fragments of international broadcasts. These messages, fragile as they were, ignited sparks of belief that they had not been forgotten. Yet alongside resilience came shadows of despair. Illness spread quickly in the crowded quarters. Tuberculosis, dysentery, frostbite. Women whispered comfort to those who coughed through the night, wiping their brows with cloths dampened in icy water. Vulnerabilities could not be hidden. Coercion by guards loomed, and sometimes pregnancies occurred under circumstances never spoken aloud in daylight. A hush would fall when such truths surfaced, but even then, whispers of solidarity tried to shield the most exposed. One former auxiliary later recalled, "We whispered to keep each other alive. If you could still speak, still share a memory or a joke, then you had not yet surrendered." These whispers became the heartbeat of the camp. They carried both strength and fragility, revealing how survival was never only about calories or rations. Soap, traded and treasured, restored the body's surface dignity. But whispered words of hymns, of prayers, of remembered streets and songs kept the soul intact. Every night, in defiance of silence imposed by barbed wire and bureaucracy, the women's voices rose just enough to remind themselves they were still human. And as days turned into months, those whispers built a community no guard could fully break. May 1945. Across Europe, the guns had fallen silent. Cities cheered, flags were raised, and surrender documents were signed. Yet for thousands of German women behind barbed wire, the end of the war did not bring an end to captivity. For them, freedom remained suspended, postponed by bureaucracy, by vengeance, and by labor demands. In the Soviet Union, orders from the NKVD kept women in camps long after victory had been declared. They were categorized not as prisoners of war, but as reparations labor. Nurses who had once bandaged wounds now carried bricks. Factory workers repaired Soviet machinery. Even clerks and secretaries were put to work cataloging supplies in warehouses far from home. Months stretched into years. For some, release came only in 1946, 1947, or later. The journey back to Germany was not a triumphant homecoming, but another ordeal. Women were packed onto trains, traveling westward through landscapes scarred by war. Villages lay in ashes, bridges blown apart, and fields lay fallow. Along the tracks, civilians scavenged ruins for firewood or scraps of coal. From train windows, the returning prisoners saw the true devastation of their homeland. When they finally arrived, the paradox became sharper. Those who stepped out of Soviet or American captivity often found themselves in cities where survival was harder than it had been behind wire. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne. Streets were reduced to rubble. Bomb craters cut through neighborhoods. Bread lines wound endlessly around distribution centers. "I came home," one former Luftwaffe auxiliary later wrote in her diary, "and there was less bread than in the camp." Families were scattered. Some parents had perished under Allied bombing. Children had been evacuated to the countryside, their whereabouts uncertain. Husbands were dead, missing, or still imprisoned in Siberia. The women, once considered fortunate to have survived, now faced suspicion from neighbors and shame within their communities. "How did you live so well while we starved?" became the whispered question. Those who admitted to having been POWs in America, or even in certain Soviet camps, were often met with disbelief or resentment. Letters home had rarely conveyed the relative order of captivity, but rumors spread. Some women concealed their entire experience, saying only that they had been away. Others carried the weight of guilt, torn between gratitude for survival and shame at having eaten better in prison than their families had in freedom. One nurse confessed years later, "I could not tell my mother that I had meat twice a week while she boiled nettles. It would have broken her." This cruel irony lingered. Captivity, designed to punish and degrade, had preserved many of their lives. Freedom, when it finally came, offered little more than hunger and ruin. The road home was not just a journey across borders. It was a passage into silence. Many women locked away their memories, unable to reconcile the paradox of their survival. Others, in rare testimonies decades later, spoke of it with tears, how captivity had given them structure, food, and even dignity, while liberation left them adrift in a shattered nation. As this chapter closes, the story edges towards final reflection. How do we remember women whose survival was written in paradox? The war had ended, the camps were dismantled, and the prisoners dispersed into a ruined world. Yet the true legacy of captivity lingered not in ruined barracks or official records, but in the memories carried by the women themselves. Diaries, letters, and later oral histories revealed the contradictions they bore for the rest of their lives. Shame for having survived more comfortably than their starving families, gratitude for unexpected moments of mercy, and silence born of fear that no one outside captivity would ever understand. For decades, many kept their stories hidden. In post-war Germany, where rubble was cleared and narratives of suffering multiplied, there was little room for women who admitted they had eaten bread behind barbed wire while their mothers boiled weeds in cellars. Some neighbors suspected collaboration. Others dismissed their accounts as exaggeration. "I learned to say nothing," one former nurse recalled, because no one wanted to hear that captivity was not always the worst. And yet, the document survived. In the quiet of attics and archives, their diaries spoke. One auxiliary wrote by candlelight in 1945, "Soap, a sliver only, saved me. It kept me clean. It kept me human." Her words, once private, now resonate as testimony. What might have seemed trivial in peacetime, soap, water, a comb carved from bone, became enduring symbols of dignity in defeat. Historians today no longer treat these voices as curiosities. Instead, they recognize them as essential to understanding the moral complexity of World War II. These women's lives complicate the neat divisions of victim and perpetrator, enemy and ally. They remind us that captivity can hold both cruelty and unexpected mercy, that survival is measured not only in calories consumed, but in rituals preserved. The paradox circles back to that first image. March 10th, 1944, a shard of soap in the snow of a Soviet camp. It was never just hygiene. It was defiance. It was resilience. It was identity, stubbornly preserved when every structure sought to erase it. Each wash, each whispered prayer, each exchange of a bar for a crust of bread was a small act of rebellion against dehumanization. The legacy is not triumph in the conventional sense. These women did not emerge as victors, nor were they only victims. Their story is a paradox of dignity and defeat, of finding humanity in a system built to strip it away. And that paradox reaches beyond barbed wire. It is a reminder that war is never simple. Enemies may offer unexpected mercy. Home may hold only ruin. Survival, in the end, is not about victory alone. It is about memory, resilience, and the rituals that keep dignity alive even when the world collapses. As the camera fades from the rusted wire and snow-covered watchtowers, it lingers on the smallest of objects, a worn, half-used bar of soap. Fragile, ordinary, yet powerful enough to carry the weight of survival, resistance, and the enduring truth that even in captivity, humanity finds ways to endure.